Imagine leading millions of people through a barren wasteland. Every day, complaints fill your ears. Every step, they doubt you. And now, they're desperate for water again. Speak to the rock, God commands. But in a single moment of frustration, Moses makes a choice that will change his destiny forever. What went so terribly wrong? And why did this one act cost Moses the promised land? Stay with me as we unravel this shocking moment in history. The story is found in Numbers 20 verses 7 to 13. Moses was no stranger to miracles. He had stood before Pharaoh, staff in hand, watching God turn the mighty Nile into blood. He had seen plagues devastate Egypt while the Israelites remained untouched. He had walked through the Red Sea on dry ground, the waters towering like walls on either side. He had climbed Mount Sinai and stood in the presence of the Almighty, receiving the very laws that would shape an entire nation. And yet, despite all the wonders, despite all the divine encounters, leading the Israelites was no easy task. They were a people bound by generations of slavery, quick to complain, quick to doubt, and slow to trust. For nearly 40 years, Moses had guided them through the wilderness. He had seen the older generation perish because of their disobedience. He had endured rebellion, betrayals, and the weight of their constant grumbling. And now, as they neared the end of their journey, another crisis arose. They had no water. The sun beat down mercilessly on the camp at Kadesh, a barren wilderness in the region of Zin. The Israelites, weary and parched, gathered in an angry mob before Moses and his brother Aaron. Their voices rose in frustration. "Why have you brought us into this wilderness, only to die here?" they shouted. "Why did you take us out of Egypt if this is where we would end up? There's no grain, no figs, no vines, no pomegranates, and now, not even water." It was the same complaint Moses had heard time and time again. He had seen their parents grumble decades earlier. He had watched them long for the land of their slavery, forgetting the miracles of their freedom. But this time, it hit differently. Moses' sister, Miriam, had just died. Numbers 20 verse 1. She had been with him since the beginning, his protector as a baby, his supporter as a leader. Her passing left a deep void in his heart. And now, before he even had time to grieve, the people were at his throat once again. He was tired. He was weary. And he was angry. Moses and Aaron withdrew to the tabernacle, falling on their faces before God. And once again, the glory of the Lord appeared. Then the Lord spoke. "Take your staff, gather the assembly, and speak to the rock before their eyes. It will pour out water, and you will provide drink for the entire community and their livestock." Numbers 20 verse 8. It was a simple command. God had worked through Moses and a rock before, back in Exodus 17, when the people had first thirsted for water. Back then, God had told Moses to strike the rock, and water had gushed out. But this time, God's instruction was different. This time, Moses was only to speak to the rock. Moses took the staff as commanded. He and Aaron gathered the people before the rock. But something in Moses snapped. He was frustrated. He was hurt. And in that moment, he let his emotions lead him instead of obedience to God. Standing before the crowd, Moses glared at them. His voice rose in frustration. "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Numbers 20 verse 10. Where did that come from? Was it Moses and Aaron providing the water? Or was it God? But Moses, overcome with anger, didn't stop there. Instead of speaking to the rock, he lifted his staff and struck it twice. Crack! The staff smacked against the rock. Crack! A second blow. Water gushed out, and the people drank. They cheered and rejoiced. The crisis was over. Or so they thought. As the last drops of water were gathered, God spoke, but not in approval. "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." Numbers 20 verse 12. Moses froze. His heart pounded. Did he hear correctly? For 40 years, he had led them. For 40 years, he had endured hardship. For 40 years, he had dreamed of setting foot in the promised land. And now, in a single moment of frustration, that dream was gone. God had still provided the water. But Moses' disobedience, his choice to act in anger rather than obedience, came with a heavy price. Moses had led the Israelites for nearly 40 years. He had faithfully followed God's commands, interceded for the people, and endured incredible hardships. But in Numbers 20 verses 7 to 13, after one act of disobedience, striking the rock instead of speaking to it, God declared that Moses would not enter the promised land. To many, this may seem like a harsh punishment. After all, Moses had served God so faithfully. Was this mistake really so severe? Why did God disqualify him from entering the land he had worked so hard to reach? There are several key reasons why this act of disobedience was so serious. First, Moses misrepresented God's character. When Moses struck the rock in anger, he misrepresented God before the people. Instead of showing God's patience, mercy, and power, Moses acted out of frustration, making it seem as if God was just as angry as he was. Moses yelled at the people, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Numbers 20 verse 10. First, he called them rebels in a tone of frustration, which may have reflected his emotions but was not God's intended response. Second, and more seriously, he said, "Must we bring you water?" implying that he and Aaron were the ones providing the miracle. In reality, God alone was providing the water, not Moses and Aaron. By taking credit for the miracle, Moses made it seem as if he had some power apart from God. This was a direct misrepresentation of God's nature and authority. As a leader, Moses' actions carried extra weight. When leaders misrepresent God, it can have lasting spiritual consequences for those they lead. Second, Moses directly disobeyed God's clear command. God's instruction was very specific. "Take the staff, and assemble the congregation, you and your brother Aaron, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water." Numbers 20 verse 8. God had not told Moses to strike the rock. He explicitly commanded him to speak to the rock. But instead, Moses struck it twice. This is significant because obedience is not just about achieving the right outcome, it's about following God's exact instructions. In Exodus 17 verse 6, when the Israelites were first in need of water, God had instructed Moses to strike the rock. That time, striking the rock was an act of obedience. But now, in Numbers 20, the instruction had changed. God wanted Moses to speak, not strike. By repeating what he had done before instead of following God's new command, Moses failed to fully obey. Partial obedience is still disobedience. Third, Moses acted in anger instead of trusting God. Throughout Scripture, God calls his leaders to self-control and humility, especially when leading his people. Moses was clearly angry when he stood before the people. His frustration had been building for years, and in this moment, he let it take over. Instead of following God's calm and clear instruction, he lashed out, both verbally and physically. His anger led him to take matters into his own hands, striking the rock instead of trusting God's command to simply speak to it. This was significant because God wanted to demonstrate his mercy to the Israelites, but Moses' actions made it seem like God was frustrated and harsh. This is why James 1 verses 19 to 20 warns us. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Even though the people had been difficult to lead, Moses' job as a leader was to reflect God's nature, not his own emotions. In failing to do this, he lost the privilege of leading them into the promised land. Fourth, Moses broke a powerful symbolic prophecy. This moment wasn't just about water, it carried deep spiritual significance. In 1 Corinthians 10 verse 4, Paul reveals that the rock represented Christ. They drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. In Exodus 17 verse 6, when Moses first struck the rock for water, it was a picture of Christ being struck for our salvation, dying once for the sins of the world. Now, in Numbers 20, the rock was meant to symbolize Christ's continued provision. This time, Moses was only supposed to speak to the rock, just as today, we receive the blessings of Christ by faith and prayer, not by striking him again. By striking the rock a second time, Moses broke this prophetic picture and ruined an important biblical symbol of God's plan of redemption. Christ was struck once for our sins on the cross. Hebrews 9 verse 28. He does not need to be struck again. Now, we come to him in faith and prayer. Moses' actions distorted this powerful foreshadowing of Jesus, which was a major reason why God responded so seriously. Fifth, leadership comes with higher accountability. Moses had been given a high level of responsibility as the leader of Israel. He had spoken with God face to face, Exodus 33 verse 11. He had been chosen to deliver the law, lead the people, and intercede for them. With great leadership comes great accountability. Luke 12 verse 48 states, "To whom much is given, much will be required." James 3 verse 1 warns that teachers and leaders will be judged more strictly. Moses had seen more of God's power and presence than anyone else, so God held him to a higher standard. His disobedience, though seemingly small, was a serious offense because it involved direct defiance of God's command. Because of this, God could not let him enter the promised land. It was a public consequence for a public failure, showing the Israelites that God's commands must be taken seriously. After this incident, God reaffirmed his judgment. "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." Numbers 20 verse 12. Moses' one act of frustration and disobedience cost him his greatest dream, entering the promised land. Later, in Deuteronomy 34, Moses stood on Mount Nebo, looking out over the land he had longed for. He could see it, but he would never set foot in it. And there, he died. God personally buried him, and his legacy remained, but his mistake had cost him dearly. Here are the lessons from the story. 1. Obedience matters even in small details. When God gives an instruction, he expects it to be followed exactly as he commanded, not partially, not approximately, but fully. This is one of the most crucial lessons from Moses' mistake in Numbers 20. At first glance, it might seem like a minor issue. After all, water still flowed from the rock, and the people's needs were met. But obedience is not just about results, it's about honoring God's authority and trustworthiness. Moses was told to speak to the rock, but instead, he struck it twice. Though the act may have seemed small in the eyes of men, to God, it was a violation of his specific instruction. This was not the first time God had commanded Moses to bring water from a rock. In Exodus 17, God told him to strike the rock, and it was the right action at the time. But now, years later, the command had changed, and Moses failed to follow the new instruction. This teaches us that we cannot rely on past instructions when God gives us new directions. Sometimes, what worked before is no longer what God is asking for now. Moses' failure to obey cost him deeply. He lost the chance to enter the promised land. In our own lives, we might be tempted to overlook the small details of obedience, thinking that as long as the outcome is good, our actions don't matter. But God sees beyond the result. He looks at the heart of obedience. A small act of disobedience may not seem significant at the moment, but it can have serious long-term consequences. When God speaks, are we listening carefully? Do we obey fully, or do we make adjustments based on what seems right to us? True obedience is trusting that God's way is always best even when we don't understand why. 2. God is serious about how we represent him. One of the most significant consequences of Moses' action in Numbers 20 was that he misrepresented God before the people of Israel. Instead of showing God's patience and power through simple obedience, Moses acted out of frustration, making it seem as if he and Aaron were the ones providing the water. When he stood before the crowd, Moses said, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Numbers 20 verse 10. This statement alone showed a shift in focus. Who was truly providing the water? It wasn't Moses or Aaron, it was God. But in his anger, Moses spoke as if he and Aaron were the ones working the miracle. This is a powerful warning for anyone in a position of spiritual leadership, whether as a pastor, teacher, mentor, parent, or someone influencing others in their walk with God. We are representatives of God, and when we let emotions take over, we risk portraying him in a way that is inaccurate. God wanted to demonstrate his mercy and provision in this moment, but Moses' reaction made it seem like God was impatient and frustrated with the people. This was not a reflection of God's true heart, but because Moses was his chosen leader, His mistake misrepresented God's nature. As Christians, our words and actions shape how others perceive God. If we act harshly, impatiently, or pridefully while claiming to represent Him, people might assume that God is also harsh, impatient, or distant. But if we respond with grace, obedience, and humility, we help others see God's love and faithfulness clearly. Moses' story reminds us that spiritual leadership carries responsibility. How we live, speak, and respond to situations should always reflect God's character, not just our emotions. Third, anger can lead to regret. Moses was one of the greatest leaders in biblical history, yet even he was not immune to the dangers of uncontrolled anger. His outburst in Numbers 20 verses 10 to 11, where he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, was not just an act of disobedience, it was a moment of frustration that led to lifelong regret. Moses had every reason to be frustrated. The Israelites had complained for decades, constantly doubting, forgetting God's miracles, and accusing him of leading them to destruction. And this wasn't the first time they had grumbled about water, Exodus 17. Now, after so many years, the new generation was repeating the same complaints. Moses was tired, worn down, and grieving the recent death of his sister, Miriam, Numbers 20 verse 1. But frustration, no matter how justified, can be dangerous. When anger takes control, it clouds judgment. Instead of responding the way God instructed, Moses lashed out, striking the rock twice instead of speaking to it. At that moment, his emotions overpowered his obedience, and it cost him deeply. Many of us have been in situations where anger took over. Maybe we snapped at someone we love, made a rash decision, or acted impulsively, only to later regret it. Anger can make us say or do things that leave lasting consequences. Moses' story serves as a warning. A single moment of unchecked frustration can undo years of faithful service. That's why James 1 verses 19 to 20 reminds us, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Before acting in anger, we must pause, pray, and ask for wisdom so that we don't let frustration lead us to choices we'll regret forever. 4. God still provides, even when we fail. One of the most powerful takeaways from Numbers 20 verses 7 to 13 is that God's faithfulness is not dependent on human perfection. Even though Moses disobeyed by striking the rock instead of speaking to it, God still provided water for the Israelites. This moment reveals a crucial truth about God's character. He is merciful, even when his people fail. If God had withheld water because of Moses' mistake, the entire nation would have suffered. But God's provision was based on his covenant, not Moses' performance. The Israelites still needed water, and God, in his grace, gave it to them. This reminds us that God's plans are bigger than individual failures. But while God still provided, there was also a consequence for disobedience. Moses was not permitted to enter the promised land. This teaches us two things. 1. God's mercy is abundant, but our actions still have consequences. Even when God forgives, disobedience can close doors in our lives. 2. God can still use us, even when we make mistakes. Moses continued leading Israel after this failure. God did not abandon him, even though his mistake cost him personally. This lesson is an encouragement to all of us. We have all fallen short, Romans 3 verse 23. We have all made mistakes. But our failures do not cancel God's promises. Even when we stumble, God is still faithful to provide, guide, and fulfill his purposes. So if you've ever felt like you've messed up too badly for God to use you, remember Moses. His failure didn't stop God's provision, and neither will yours. God's grace is greater than our mistakes. Moses led with faith. He performed miracles. He spoke with God face to face. But in one moment of frustration, he lost the very thing he longed for. What about you? Have you ever let frustration take control? Have you ever made a decision in anger that you later regretted? Moses' story is a reminder that obedience matters, that our emotions must never override God's instructions, and that even in failure, God's mercy remains. Moses didn't enter the promised land, but his story didn't end in failure. He left behind a legacy of faith, leadership, and endurance. And today, His journey teaches us one simple truth: trust God completely, even when it's hard. Thank you for watching Scriptures in Pictures TV, where the Bible comes alive through animation. If this story inspired you, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this lesson today. Remember, the greatest stories aren't just told, they're lived. Choose obedience, choose faith, and let God lead your journey. See you in the next story.